This is the Vincast, an Australian podcast that delves into the world of wine by chatting with different people who work in the wine industry in each episode and finds out about their background, their philosophies, and how they influence what they do in the world of wine. Now, as this is a completely free of charge podcast, I would love for you to provide some support, and that can be in the form of sharing your experiences of the podcast on social media, or telling a friend who loves wine to listen to the podcast, or by going to the iTunes page for the Vincast, leaving a 5-star rating and also a review, because it provides really good feedback for potential listeners and also for potential guests. Thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I hope you enjoy. On episode 91 of the Vincast, I chat with Simão Killeen, a multi-generational winemaker from the Rutherglen region of Victoria, who is now carving out his own identity with his own wines under the Simão Co brand. Hello there, Vincasters, and welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Gasbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino. Hope you enjoyed last week's episode of the podcast. Of course, it's always great to have insight into how far the Australian wine industry has come, so it was great to chat with Neil Robb. And this week I've changed things up a little bit by having a young winemaker as my guest. But before I get into that, I just want to let you know that I would love to hear from you. I would love if you've got any questions that you might want to ask about me or about the podcast, about some of the guests, or about wine in general. Please do get in touch with me. You can do that via email. You can find me on thevincast@gmail.com, or why not hit me up on any form of social media you can find me on, or just send me a message on the intrepidwino.com website. So as mentioned, I have Simão Killeen on this episode of the Vincast. Simon's family background is in the Rutherglen region, particularly famous for fortified wines, but he has started his own brand, and he's really trying to champion the northeast region of Victoria. So we chatted about his background, his journey with winemaking, and how he's championing that particular part of Australian wine. So hope you enjoy. Stick around to the end of the episode to find out how you can get in touch with Simon and myself. But until then, I'll see you on the other side. Simon, thank you for coming down from. Where are you based? I'm not even sure. Are you based in the Rutherglen?
Yeah, based in Rutherglen.
Thanks for coming down from the Rutherglen to be on the Vincast, and welcome. I really appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And you may be aware, I typically start every episode of the podcast by asking my guest if they have a memory, or what their first memory of wine was that really sticks in there and might have kind of led them to following a career path.
Okay. I actually don't have an early memory. I know that it must have been very, very young that I've had something that's triggered off my interest. Most likely the fact that my father was a winemaker and my grandfather was a winemaker.
Yeah.
But I'd probably say that the earliest memory I would have would be following the grape harvester and picking the grapes that the harvester missed and trying to throw them back in the bin.
Not eating them?
Not eating them. No. This is before school, before Mum had to take me to school.
Yeah.
And then it was probably going back to the winery and watching it all get crushed and go into the vat.
Yeah. So you had an interest when you were very, very young?
Yeah, never wanted to do anything else.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, I'm one of those odd people who've known exactly what they've wanted to do from a very young age.
Because I know it's quite common for children of winemaking families, maybe, and probably in some cases encouraged to go away and think really hard. Do you absolutely want to, follow, the family business and working in wine, and maybe they go and get a degree in something in marketing or business or something like that, and then they go and work somewhere else, and then they eventually come back. You knew, I was like, this is all I want to do?
Yeah, exactly. But I was still told by Dad to go away and work elsewhere. I was always asking him questions, and he was adamant that no, you're not coming home after school because you'll stay here. Go away, learn stuff, earn your keep, bugger up in someone else's winery before you come home.
But it was going and working in the wine industry, not in a different industry altogether?
No, he wanted me to decide if I actually wanted to come home,
Okay,
or if I wanted to pursue something else. There was a brief moment that I flirted with the idea of being an architect or an engineer.
Yeah.
But as soon as I finished school, I moved out of home immediately, got a job at a winery, and absolutely loved what I was doing.
Did you have an interest in sort of like technical stuff? Is that kind of why you had an interest in maybe doing architecture?
Yeah, that probably stems from my love for Lego as a kid. But I always been a very good drawer and an artist, and I dabbled in graffiti when I was in high school. So I was really keen to be a graphic designer.
Yeah.
I contemplated doing fine arts at uni or graphic design. Or architecture, and then realised that I've got no hope of putting a portfolio together and getting an enter score of 96. So I just threw that out the window and said, let's just keep it as a hobby. But no, very much sort of an artistic-minded person.
So were you working like as a teenager when you were at school for the family business, or were you working for other wineries as well?
As a teenager, I would work most holidays for Grandpa. We'd be doing sheep work together. We'd be doing irrigating together. Oh, cool. Okay, so not just viticulture or winemaking, but other agricultural stuff. No, the farm's 1,000 acres.
Sure,
and it's a mixed farm. So there's livestock. So there's sheep. We had Vealers cattle growing up, and we got rid of them. We also had crop, and then we also had probably 100 acres of vines, which grew. That number grew from about 40 to 100 in my growing up. Dad grew the business with Grandpa. And we also had the winery as well. So it was a nice little mixed agricultural business. A lot of the wineries around Rutherglen are like that. They're mixed farms.
Is it very common in the Rutherglen for producers to just grow all their own grapes, or is it also common for growers to sell their grapes to the producers?
A bit of both. A lot of the wineries have their own vineyards, and the majority of what they would crush would be what they grow themselves. But then the larger companies would also buy a fair bit. So Pfeiffer's and Campbell's definitely. Dad bought a little bit, but from what I know, there's not much fruit being bought there now. Unlike myself, who I buy a lot of grapes, there aren't many producers who would be buying most of their crush.
So Stanton Killeen was the business.
Was home, yes.
Yes. And being in the Rutherglen, if you didn't know that the Rutherglen is possibly the most famous region for fortified wines in Australia, I don't know why you're listening to this podcast, but anyway. But was that the majority of the business, or was there also quite a lot of table wine being produced?
Growing up, Dad was always about 50-50, as in what we would grow would be about 75% fortified varieties. Fortified varieties. And then what we would sell would be 50-50. Now that number has slowly changed to probably about 50% table wine, 50% fortified being grown, and then what has been sold is probably the majority. It's probably maintain the same 50-50 sales.
So are you saying that 75% of the grape production would produce 50% of the volume of wine?
Yeah, the volume of wine sold.
Wine sold, okay.
And you've got to remember that is also, you've got to take into account, a lot of the wine would be barreled down.
Sure.
And so not all of it would get released within the first year.
Right, okay. So for those who are possibly not as familiar with fortified wines, particularly Australian fortified wines, because whilst in the past they were, a lot of what was consumed in Australia as far as wine, but now not so much. Can you just give people an idea about what fortified wine is, and particularly in the context of Rutherglen?
Okay. So a fortified wine is essentially wine that has had alcohol added. Now that alcohol can be what we call brandy spirit, which is not brandy. Brandy has to have at least 2 years in oak to be called brandy. It's the spirit that comes from the still that is of that style. Or it can be SVR, which stands for Latin, which is Spiritus Vini Rectificatus, and that is just high-strength neutral grape spirit. and you generally use that for muskets and tokais or topakes, whereas the former you use for more port production.
Okay.
Now, the grapes are generally picked a lot riper than, say, Shiraz or Cabernet or any red or white table grape. Sorry, table wine. And then there is a small sort of fermentation period, and then you would add the spirit either to the fermentation, or you'd press it off and then add it to the must, the juice, I should say, and that would keep some sweetness, some sugar, and replace the alcohol that you would get naturally from the yeast turning all that sugar into alcohol. So you would basically add the alcohol to keep some sweetness,
and that stops the fermentation.
That knocks it on the head. When you're adding 96% alcohol, the yeast pack up and say, I don't want to be here. I'm going to go home. And the fermentation ends up being, after fortification, ends up being about 17-18% alcohol.
Okay.
And yeast aren't that resilient.
So if you add the spirit whilst the skins are still in contact with the fermentation, are they pressed off almost immediately?
Generally, yes.
Okay.
Because if you add such a high percentage of alcohol within the spirit, that can also cause a greater extraction of the skins. So you can get a lot of colour, and you can also get a heightened extraction of phenolics, some bitterness. And so it can be beneficial, or it also can be detrimental to the wine. And it all comes down to personal preference and style for the winemaker.
Okay. What are the grape varieties that are typically used for fortified wines?
So we used to have, I think the law stipulated that you could make muscat and tokay out of anything you wanted as long as they were of that style. You had to have a muscety aroma. Whereas today, the law says that muscat has to be made out of muscats of Petit Grand Rouge, which is essentially little red grape muscat. And in Rutherglen, we call it Rutherglen brown muscat. It's a special little red mutant of just the muscat of Petit Grands. Whereas Tokay, Muscadel, is actually made out of the Muscadel grape variety, which is a Bordelais variety. It goes into Sauternes. Whereas port, on the other hand, port can be a multitude of different varieties. Commonly in Australia, it's Shiraz, Grenache, Mataro, or Girif. But there's a lot of producers using the traditional Portuguese varieties, Touriga Nacional, Tinta Roriz, which is Tempranillo, Tinta Cao. There's a newfound interest in using those varieties. And then you've got sherry. Sherry's basically made out of Palomino, can be Trebbiano, Monbardon, Pedro Ximenez.
But I guess Rutherglen probably has changed a lot and is focusing a lot more on dry table wines now. And is that something that you've been quite involved with? And is there kind of a new energy around that? You know, particularly with the younger generations coming through. Because Rutherglen is one of the oldest wine regions in Australia, particularly in terms of unbroken family ownership of wineries. Is there kind of a bit of do you get together with some of the other young generation producers?
Of course. I've got a really good clique of friends, not only in Rutherglen, but the greater northeast area. We're all about the same age. We've either started our own wineries or we've taken over the reins at our family wineries. And it's a really fun time to be working in the wine industry in northeast Victoria at the moment. I've got a couple of really good mates in Beechworth who we catch up regularly. Actually, we catch up so regularly that we've got a little, I guess you could say, touring group, which is sort of half trade, half footy trip, called the Thursday Table. And the name stems from the fact that we used to meet probably once a month on a Thursday night in Beechworth, because the restaurant we used to catch up at had a BYO night on the Thursday. So we'd generally catch up, take a couple of really good bottles of wine, and just rub shoulders and talk to each other about what we're up to, and also just have a social catch-up.
So how did you kind of... did you go away and did you go and study winemaking, or did you go and get winemaking experience in other places?
Yeah, so I left school immediately. I finished school and started work immediately. And I worked in the Alpine Valleys, so for a company called Gapstead, or Victorian Alpine Co. And that was my first vintage away from home when I was 18. And loved the vintage. They asked me to stay on. So I stayed there for about 18 months. And then I came home and I worked for Pfeiffer's Wines briefly. Then I started university. I didn't go to uni straight out of school because I didn't think I was going to get in. I didn't think I wasn't. I'm a smart kid, but I'm not a good student.
Distracted.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a brat. And so I didn't expect to get the enter score to get into uni. Anyway, I did. And I said, no, I've got this job. I'm going to get a bit of experience first. And so I did that for 2 years, went away to uni and did that for a couple of years before the CSU. I went to Wagga before the CSU course became a fully distance correspondence course.
Oh, okay.
And so I was the last year level of being an internal student. And I thought, I don't want to do this. I don't want to live in Wagga and try and get my course done by doing it by distance. I'll be bored. So I went and got a job in Western Australia. So I drove myself over there and worked for Voyager in Margaret River.
Yep.
And then I had a girlfriend at the time, which I ended up following my heart back to Griffith, where she was from. And I ended up working for cellars. Mm-hmm. And I was in the cellar there and trainee winemaker there. And then I realised that I had to make the decision to stay there, work for a big corporate company. And that, although that did excite me, it also scared me that I'd lose a bit of freedom for the industry and I wasn't going to go overseas. So I resigned, and coincidentally, the day after I resigned, I actually got offered a job in France. And so I took myself over there to work for Chapoutier in the Rhone Valley, which I love Shiraz. So that's the reason why I went there. And then
you're racing through this.
Yeah.
You're sort of glossing over, like, this is a lot of experience in different wine regions.
Yeah.
How did you find the Margaret River? Actually, no, let's go right back. Working at Gapstead would have been pretty interesting because you probably would have been exposed to a really huge range of different grape varieties. Was that quite interesting?
That was one of the reasons why I love the Northeast so far, and it explained to me the diversity and the versatility that the Northeast Valleys have, because I think we played with something like 34 varieties, different varieties there, and batches from as small as half a ton up to probably 50 ton. And it was really good because I also got to see a really good array of growers there. So, and that's also where I met some of the growers that I have today for my label.
Okay, yeah.
And I got to see the better vineyards. So that gave me the insight to be able to go on my own and say, right, I love your fruit. I want your fruit. Can you please jump on board with me? What
were some of the quirkier varieties that you really enjoyed working with back then?
Saperavi was really interesting, and it was cool. Isabella, which is a hybrid variety, but when it came in the cellar, it was just like bubble gum sitting in the vat. Petit Manseng, they were really championing Petit Manseng at that time, and they were making some great wines out of it. And they were also kicking goals with Barbera and Sangiovese at the time, which now is a little bit more common in the Australian wine scene.
Certainly Sangiovese.
Very much so, yeah. But at that stage, people were still consumers, I should say, were still pretty unaware of them.
And reluctant to try them.
But they were probably the more fun ones that I got to see.
Yeah.
Especially when you think that, where's Petit Manseng from? It's from Jurason. Saperavi, it's a Georgian variety.
Yeah.
These things were really foreign to the greater industry at the time.
Yeah. Well, I remember stopping with my dad at Gapstead on the way up to Mount Hotham and sort of looking at this long list of all these varieties. And, I was still pretty green at that point. And that was kind of when I got introduced to Saperavi myself and kind of went, wow, what, Georgian, you say? Oh, okay. And, having now tasted more Georgian wine, and I had, John Verdeman from Pheasant's Tears as a guest, kind of being able to say, well, actually, we have Saperavi in Australia, and that kind of blew him away a little bit. And how was it? You drove across the Margaret River?
Yeah, I did actually. I finished uni for the year, and then what was I doing? I can't remember. Packed myself up, and I had a VZ Ute at the time, so typical young fella vehicle, V8, and drove across from Griffith through to South Australia, then across the Nullarbor. I had my swag in the back and my mountain bike as well, and stopped along the way until I got to Margaret River, and then started work there, and pretty much did 5 months there.
Yeah.
It was great.
Yeah.
I really liked it.
Did you do a bunch of surfing whilst you were there?
No, I can't surf to save myself.
Okay, well, that makes two of us. And then you came back and worked. A voyage is not small, but they're pretty. I guess WA doesn't have a lot of really big wine companies.
No.
To go from that to working for Casella, who, for those who aren't aware, make probably one of Australia's most famous brands, particularly in the export market, Yellowtail. And I've never visited myself, but the words tank the word tank and the word farm tend to be referenced as far as Casella. What was that like?
Oh, amazing.
Yeah.
I'm very proud I worked there because there are a lot of people in the industry who are probably too proud to work for such a large company because they're
and just happily just slag it off.
Exactly, because they look at the idea of a mass-produced commodity with no love, no intention of quality. It's just grapes come on trucks and we make Coca-Cola to come out the other side. Consistency regardless of the vintage.
Yeah.
I actually liked being there because it didn't just teach me about consistency and also business and people management. It also told me about logistics and told me it made me aware of how to run a winery efficiently. And it also, well, I said people management before, but it really taught me how to run a well-oiled machine and have a good team because they
collaborate.
They had 300 cellar hands in the middle of vintage.
Wow.
It was amazing.
All in the middle of nowhere, pretty much, which is Griffith.
Pretty much, yeah.
And I guess to a large extent, when you're working with big volumes and being able to learn how to manage that, when you go back to very small volumes, it's probably just makes it so much easier. And go, oh, this wasn't too hard. I guess the difference being that you probably don't have 300 cellar hands, working with your wines.
Yeah, exactly. No, it was good because you go to a smaller production size and you can take away elements of a large volume winery, such as, like I said before, efficiency. So you try and work out what's the most efficient way, because small wineries are quite labor intensive. So you try and make the decisions of the easiest way to process your grapes. It could be as simple as, I don't want my vat over there because it's a long way from the crusher, or something simple like that. But it also teaches you to be, I guess, aware of loss of if you drop a bucket of wine on the ground, well, you're losing a bit of income there. Whereas in a big company, you don't care about that, but still you try and make sure that you're a clean worker, so you don't do that. And so you can take away things like that into the smaller winery.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you ended up in France, in the Rhone Valley. Had you done any travel overseas before then?
No.
Not really?
No.
Okay.
So that was my first independent trip overseas.
Were you anxious about going and working in a French winery? Did you? I'm assuming. Sorry, I don't mean to assume, but I assume you didn't speak much French.
I taught myself French.
Right. Before you went?
Yes.
Oh, cool. Okay.
So I taught myself French, and I was not nervous. I was actually really excited because at that period, I was just a sponge for knowledge about Shiraz production, Shiraz around the world. Yeah. And I was eagerly awaiting my visit there. I wanted to go and see the vineyards of Hermitage. I wanted to go and see Saint-Joseph, Cornas, Côte Rôties, and drink all those wines. I'd already bought a stack of it, and I loved all the styles, and I was really inspired by it. So when I got there, I was really enjoying it. The only problem was my French wasn't as good as I thought I was, and so I actually locked myself in my bedroom for about 4 days and just rote learned French that I'd taught myself, but relearned it. Yeah. And then my sister rang me, and she had already studied French at university, and she was really excited for me and said, "How are you going?" I said, "I haven't left my bedroom." And she goes, "Oh, you're such a goose. You've got to get lost to find yourself." Yeah. And so I went out there and started talking. And by the time
That's how you learn.
Yeah, exactly. So when I came back to Australia, and also now, I'm not fluent, but I've got very good conversational French.
Proficient.
Exactly.
And you probably understand a lot more just by listening, because you've heard it. You've been surrounded by French people speaking French, and so you kind of, the context of being in that situation, where you see them say something and they point to something, or they're holding something, or the conversation is on that topic. You kind of go, oh yeah, I know what that means. I can hear that sentence. I can pick up the words and kind of know, oh, this is what they're talking about. How long did you end up spending there?
About 6 months.
Yeah, so it's pretty much just sort of one season.
Yeah, a bit before vintage, and then a bit after vintage as well.
Yeah. And you came back. And what were you doing when you came back?
When I came back, I said, right, I'm ready to come home
Sure.
to Stanton Killeen. And I started working there and did that for a few years, and then went to Portugal, and when was that, 2012?
Mm-hmm.
And went over there to the Douro Valley to learn port production, of course.
Sure.
And that was my main goal. I was always going to go overseas, and it was always going to be Portugal, but other places like the Rhone or Burgundy happened for a bit of, on the side, for a bit of fun. But
for a bit of fun.
yeah, well, Burgundy was a bit of fun, but like I'm never going to make Pinot or Chardonnay.
Yeah.
But
I guess.
I loved it. It was good. But Portugal was great because I know a lot about Portugal. I know a lot about Portuguese wines, and more in particular Portuguese varietals.
Sure.
But also I know a fair bit about port because I was very fortunate to be surrounded by Dad, who was a port fiend, and just reading his books and whatnot as a kid, and also growing up, helped me to be inspired. And plus, drinking the wines that he made as well as a winemaker also inspired me.
So he liked to sort of put his wines or the wines of Rutherglen in context with some of the great port wines.
Of course, he benchmarked off a lot of the Portuguese styles, because that was the style that he liked to drink. In Australia, there's essentially two different port styles. There's the Australian style, which is generally quite rich and ripe and sweet, made out of Grenache and Shiraz or Mataro Cabernet or whatever. And then you have the drier, more elegant styles, which can be made out of those same varieties, but people are starting to use those Portuguese varieties that I mentioned earlier on. And so when I say drier, I mean they're finishing it at around about 3.5 Beaumet, whereas the sweeter Australian styles can be 4 up to 6.5 Beaumet.
Yeah,
so
okay.
Very much another 100 grams of sugar per litre.
For people who might be interested in trying some of the, as you say, the more elegant, and I probably would think maybe slightly more food friendly styles of vintage Australian port style wines. Apart from Stanton and Killeen, have you got some ones you would recommend for people who might want to try these kind of wines?
Yeah, Simão Co, my stuff,
of course,
of course. Pfeiffer wines in Rutherglen are a great example. Up there with the best of Australia, easily. Jen Pfeiffer's probably one of the best winemakers I know, and easily one of the best fortified winemakers. And she makes some stonking stuff. And they've got a lot of Touriga and a lot of Tinta Cow in their blends as well.
Okay.
919 in the Riverland are also a really good port producer and also fortified producer. And they make a more elegant style as well. Morris's are getting drier in their style, and they're very nice, but they are a little bit sweeter, but still lovely all the same. Very good examples of the style. Chambers Rosewood in Rutherglen. Steve makes a very dry style and has a multitude of those varieties as well, and is doing really well. And then anyone else over in SA?
Does Seppeltsfield make a drier style?
Seppeltsfield don't. Bailey's do. They come under the Treasury umbrella, and although they're Glenrowan, I think the majority of the wine comes from Riverland or Barossa Valley, but it's just put under Bailey's because it's a fortified sort of
house.
Yeah. I might be very wrong there, but from what I know, the last couple of vintages have been dominated by South Australian fruit.
How did you find the Portugal or the Douro experience? Did you work at a particular house?
Yeah, so I worked the primary location I worked for was Quinta de Roeda, which is a Croft house.
Sure.
And Croft is under the business of the Fladgate Partnership, and who owns Fonseca, Taylor's, and Croft. And I loved it. If I had $4 million, I would go over to Portugal and buy a Quinta in the Douro Valley and just make port for the rest of my days.
Yeah.
It is a stunning location.
What I mean, I'm lucky enough to have visited Porto and Douro as well. I'm interested to find out what you find fascinating about the Quintas and the Douro Valley and the port production.
The varieties, for one, they are allowed to use up to 80 different varieties.
Yeah.
It's just such a viticulturally diverse area.
Yeah.
But they concentrate more so on 10 varieties.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's a lot of people who still use a heap of different things in the mix. The other cool thing is the old vineyards, they're all interplanted. So you don't have a monoculture of a variety in one vineyard. You have more so now you do in some of the newer vineyards, but the older vineyards you have.
Are they vineyards that are more likely to be used for table wine rather than for port production?
Well, no, it depends. Depends on the producer.
Right. Okay.
It also depends on the vineyard site because the vineyards over there are graded, and so the better vineyards are designated for port.
Yep.
And I think that's still the case, but I don't know if some of them are going to table wine.
Mm-hmm.
But the better vineyards, especially the really old vignevellas, the old vines, you'll have one vine of Touriga, and then the next one you'll have a Tinta Amarella, and then you'll have a Suzhou, and then you'll have something that you can't even identify because it's so old. There's only, say, 3 people in Portugal who can identify them. That's exciting. The other thing is also the terroir there, the landscape is quite barren. It's a very dry area, and you go from this river that's about 3 times the size of the Murray River, and that's about 100 meters above sea level, and the top of the peaks are close to 1 kilometer above sea level.
Yeah.
Like, it's a really steep,
very steep,
dry area, and it's aesthetically stunning. But there's no mechanization. They've got all these vineyards that have been terraced into the side of the hills, almost stepped into the side of the hills, and they produce these wonderful wines of density and concentration and longevity.
Like just as far as how the valley actually looks, it kind of struck me how similar I felt to the Mosel Valley. Of course, a lot hotter.
Yeah, of course.
And I was there in summer, and whew, it got pretty hot. The thing that really sticks with me about the northern Portuguese wine production is the lagares. And the way that these beautiful, often granite, kind of stone carved, kind of fermentation vats, and like how they have a team of people go in and actually foot stomp, and to macerate the wines, and if they're doing it traditionally, they have to do it in complete silence, and it's pretty incredible kind of tradition that they have in Portugal, and obviously that plays into the port production as well. So you took away a lot from that experience?
Yeah, most definitely. In particular, how you're talking about the lagares, that technique of foot stomping and the macerating of that in that way is the way I make my ports.
Right.
So I want that high concentration, that high extraction, but yet a gentle extraction.
Mm-hmm.
I don't do it in silence. I generally have quite a fast, hip, fun dance song in the background going, or some dubstep or whatever, but I just to make it a bit more fun, and generally have it with a beer in my hand somewhere, or with some friends. But that is how I make my vintage port style of port, of course. Stalk inclusion in port production is something that I use as well, which isn't common in Australia, but over there it's very common, in particular in their vintage port styles. And then I also, one of the wines I make, which is about to be released, is my white port, and that's a style that is uncommon here, but very common in Portugal, and it's just a delicious drink. And so I picked up a few techniques in how to make that style as well.
I remember when I came back after trying white ports over there, I was talking to all the importers saying, hey, can you get some white port? And no, we don't bring the white port in. It's like, why not? It's yum.
Yeah, it's delicious, especially the aged ones as well. And
yeah.
I've made it because I like to drink it, and I think it could do really well as an aperitif in summer in Australia, but also as a mixer.
Yeah, with cocktails. Absolutely.
Exactly.
I mean, they do that in Porto, and probably, I'm guessing, in Lisboa as well. So when did you kind of conceive of the idea of Simão Co?
So that came about in 2013. I'd been working at home for the farm for a few years, and I hated it. I was miserable, and I was losing inspiration and just not growing professionally. And I bit the bullet and I resigned. I'm not going. I generally sugarcoat things when it comes to a question like that, but I think family business is a great oxymoron, and I made the decision to leave because I was unhappy, and so I did. So I had this meager inheritance from Dad that I liquidated, and I went and bought my barrels. I bought some tanks. I'd already organised who my growers were going to be and picked what I wanted to make. And set about to do it on my own and do it my way. And not to pigeonhole myself for just Rutherglen, it was to try and emphasise the greater northeast region because I think it's a stunning part of Victoria, and if not Australia, but also a vinously wonderful part of Australia as well. There's so much you can do there, which is what Simâo is about.
So what encompasses the greater northeast Victoria?
Northeast Victoria includes 5 regions, Glenrowan and Rutherglen, which would be the oldest and more well-known ones. Then you've got Beechworth, which is very cool. When I say cool, I mean popular.
A lot of exciting stuff happening.
Yeah, fantastic. But I personally don't think it's a cool climate, but it does get bandied around that it is. Only parts of the very higher parts of Beechworth are cool. And my friends Tessa and Jeremy are planting a vineyard up in that cooler part, which is really cool.
If you'd like to hear more about that, please do listen to the episode of the Vincast with Tessa.
And then you've got the Alpine Valleys.
Yep.
And then you've got the King Valley as well.
Right, okay. So that's a pretty big kind of area. I mean, the King Valley is very large. Alpine Valleys incorporates, a number of different valleys. Beechworth, I would say, is probably the smallest.
Beechworth's actually the smallest region in Victoria.
Right, yeah.
By area. And Rutherglen is not far behind. Glenrowan is small by idea of where the vineyards are, but by area, it's actually bigger than you think.
Yeah. So between Glenrowan and Rutherglen and, the Alpine Valleys, we're talking, warm to cool climate. So I imagine that the opportunities viticulturally are pretty diverse. So you probably have a lot of area to play with, lots of different grape varieties as well. And you said that from right back to your experience at Gapstead, you kind of learned about that area and got some relationships with growers. Did you find it exciting to kind of bring this kind of concept into the world?
Of course, I think it's a concept that a couple of people are using, as in multi-regional Chardonnay or multi-regional Shiraz.
Yeah.
But then for me, I'm sitting there going, how can I do this well? What wines do I like to drink? What wines do I like to make? What wines do I think are well suited to the area?
Yeah.
For example, Sauvignon Blanc. I don't think it's suited to Rutherglen. I think there's a very small amount planted in Rutherglen, but I don't want to make it from Rutherglen. Yet I know of 3 very good vineyards, one whom I'm friends with, that grows exceptional Sauvignon fruit. So that's I went out and sourced it from a particular grower. I find a lot of vineyards in Australia in general, people have set out to plant what was popular at the time, as in they've thrown in Shiraz and Cabernet.
They were making economic decisions.
Exactly, and Chardonnay and Riesling.
Agricultural decisions.
Yeah, whereas you think about where all those things are grown in relation to, let's say France.
Yeah,
they're all in different parts of France, so it's really difficult to comprehend that they all came out of one vineyard.
Yeah.
So the idea of Simâo is actually going to the right area and emphasising that this area produces this variety really well.
Mm-hmm. And did you select particular varieties that you wanted to work with, or was it more about I just want really good fruit to make really good wine?
It was both. So I think Shiraz is a very versatile variety for Rutherglen, Beechworth and Glenrowan. Mm-hmm. They all produce their own personalities from those regions.
Yeah.
Yet I don't think the King Valley does Shiraz as well as what I would like to see it do. Mm-hmm. And a bit like the Alpine Valleys. There might be sites that I haven't seen, but I personally would like to prefer to make wine from those first 3 regions. But then Tempranillo, I think Tempranillo is fantastic from the Alpine Valley. I think it's making beautiful fruit from up that way. Mm-hmm. And same with Nebbiolo as well. But then also I tried to concentrate on the varieties that I have experience with and that I have, how do you say, a palate experience with. Say, I've drunk a lot of Nebbiolo and researched it a fair bit. I've drunk a lot of Tempranillo, Spanish and Portuguese Tempranillo. And the idea of my Tempranillo is that one day it will become a blend of Temp, Touriga, Suzao. It'll become a more of a Douro blend. And that is to say that this is what is done well up in this area.
Yeah. Was there kind of a particular guiding principle that you had as far as the way that you wanted to make the wines?
I think just a headstrong attitude.
Yeah.
I wanted to. There was with the Shiraz in particular. So I get sick and tired of people pigeonholing Rutherglen and Glenrowan in particular with high alcohol, full noise, big full-bodied wines. Now there is that style. I'm totally cool with that. I've got friends who make that style very well, but it's not the style that I want to make, because some of the best wines I've had in my winemaking career have actually come from Rutherglen and Glenrowan, and that's not patriotism and bias. That's actually just honesty. One of the greatest wines I ever had was a 1970 Bailey's Hermitage. I drank it when it was 41 years old, and it was brilliant. And I just thought, this is why the area was so well known for long-lived reds. And the wine wasn't big. It was still fresh, and it had great structure. And I thought, this style was common back then through Rutherglen and Glenrowan. I've drunk some brilliant Morris Shiraz and some great stuff that Grandpa made in the 70s. And I thought, I just want to go back a step and make great, elegant, structured, fine wines.
Yeah.
And also, it's inspired by a lot of the French Shiraz that I've drunk as well.
Sure.
So I use a lot of stalk in my Shiraz. Now, that is not a trend-following decision. That is actually a technical decision because of the characters that the stalk can give.
Yeah.
Same with long macerations as well.
Yeah. And the wine that I was introduced to your project with was the Uni Blanc, and it was something that I wanted to talk to you about, because again, I want to hear from you why you chose to call it Uni Blanc, because I think of that variety as far as for wine production as Trebbiano, which is of course, because anyone who knows me knows that I'm obsessed with Italian wine and Italian grape varieties. Whereas Uni Blanc is what they call it in France, typically, particularly in terms of the production of brandy in cognac and Armagnac, that kind of thing. So again, I'm interested to hear from you why you chose to call it Uni Blanc.
That was a decision that I deliberated over. I asked a lot of people in the trade, a lot of friends, a lot of winemakers, about what way I should swing. Some people said Trebbiano, definitely, and then some people said, no, go Uni Blanc. I always decided, in my heart, I was always going to call it Uni Blanc, but then the form of the word Uni Blanc, so UGNI, like Agni, if you're going to be an Australian phonetic pronunciation, is quite bold and it's offensive looking almost. But I also find it quite intriguing. And personally as well, I find, although I do like some Trebs from Italy, and I have seen some good examples in Australia, I think the connotation towards that name in Australia is towards bulk production, cask wine, and just blend fillers for one, the Riverland, and also the Riverina. And I thought, you know what? If I have it as Trebbiano, people will probably look at it sideways and probably even pass over it. Whereas if I have it as Uni Blanc, it will make people raise an eyebrow and might make them look at it twice.
And there's no associations with bulk production.
No, but if they ask what's an Uni Blanc, and you explain to them what it is, and then you say it's also called Trebbiano in Italy, they go, okay. And there's an interest point about it.
Whereas if you say Trebbiano, they'll go, they use that like for, very cheap wines. And even in Italy, I mean, Trebbiano, I think, is the most planted, Trebbiano / Uni Blanc is the most planted variety in Europe, mostly for brandy production. But, certainly, it is, as you say, a fantastic blending option in Italy with other varieties, because you can get good volume and, it's nice and fresh, that kind of thing. So I think probably Uni Blanc was the right way to go. When you explain it that way. I like Trebbiano though.
Yeah. I also did it because I've got Sauvignon Blanc and then I've got Uni-Blanc. So my white portfolio is like my Blancs.
Right. Okay. Cool. And so you have also been doing a bit of tinkering with some more fortified wines for yourself. Then some of them aren't quite ready yet, but that's something that you're excited to be working on as well.
Of course, you can't be a Rutherglen lad without having an appreciation or love for fortifieds.
Yeah.
And I'm unashamedly proud of my heritage and the Rutherglen region. But it's also, I also find there's a next level of understanding and complexity in being a fortified winemaker.
Yeah.
At the moment, I just make some port styles. So I make my white port, ruby port, and my vintage port. But this year I just started making muscat. Now, I'm very fortunate to be able to do that because muscat fruit is very difficult to come past in Rutherglen. It's very in demand. And I was lucky to get myself a ton and a half to be able to make some. And you said some aren't ready for release yet. And that is true because these things take time. These things, the muscat in particular, will take a few years in barrel and whatnot to mature and have some other wines blended into it. But then the ports, I've been doing them this is my third vintage independently.
Yeah.
And I've got some that are just about to come on release.
Excellent. And are you kind of excited at the prospect of a younger generation of wine consumers being introduced to fortified wines and possibly not having the connotations that they may have had, say, in the 90s, that they're very daggy and sweet and very simple?
That's also half the fun of what I'm doing. That was the challenge right from the outset.
Yeah.
And I was aware of that. And people did say to me, this is a very difficult thing you're doing. You're trying to go out to a market that doesn't want to drink these styles and doesn't understand any of these styles. And I've just said, well, bugger it, I'm going to make them understand. And I find I like teaching people. It's just in my instinct. I like watching people drink, say, my vintage port and go, oh, I don't like port. And then them being moved out of their comfort zone, having a sip and then going, oh, wow, this is actually drier.
Yeah.
And I like watching people's reaction. I like watching people be taught that their stereotype that they've got of the decanter on grandma's buffet at home, filled with sherry or port, isn't what a lot of the styles on the market today are like.
Well, I know, like the sherry market, they've worked very, very, very hard to show people what real sherry is, so they don't think, oh, cream sherry.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Well, look, it sounds really exciting, and I personally am really interested to sort of try more of the Simão Co wines. For people who might want to find out more about, where they can actually buy the wines or drink the wines in some of the bars and restaurants, what's the best way for them to find out more and maybe also follow you on social media, that kind of thing?
So the website, the Simão Co website, has a relatively frequently updated list of who is selling and serving the Simão wines.
Yep.
There's a lot in Melbourne. There's a few in Sydney, and you can find it in Canberra as well. And there's also my phone number that if you're in Rutherglen or the Northeast, you can generally give me a ring and catch up, say hi. The other thing is also Instagram. I use Instagram a lot. I find it a really fun platform to give people an insight, like a window into the Simão Co world, which is a combination of just me making the wine, me blending the wine, and also my group of friends in Beechworth and Rutherglen and King Valley, and who we are and what we're doing, and giving people another reason to maybe venture up the highway and come and visit us all and try the wines from up the Northeast Valleys. Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you very much, Simon, for being on the podcast. It's a pleasure.
And I look forward to hopefully coming to visit myself.
More than welcome to come up.
Cheers. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Vincast. I have been James Gasbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino. And of course, thank you to Simon for being on the show. You can follow me on social media on Instagram and Twitter. I'm at Intrepid Wino. And the podcast is also on Twitter at the Vincast. Facebook.com/intrepidwino is where you'll find my Facebook page. So hit that like button and you can see things as I share them on there. And I would love for you to come and visit my YouTube channel, which is Intrepid Wino, one word, because I do lots of videos, including Let's Tastes, where I open bottles of wine from Australia, including one of Simon's wines was the Uni Blanc. If you would like to subscribe to the podcast, that's a fantastic way to make sure you're getting the newest episode as soon as it becomes available. So if you go to iTunes, Player FM, or Stitcher, or any other number of different podcast hosting platforms, I would love for you to leave me a 5-star rating and a review to provide some feedback to potential listeners. Of course, all the information is available on the intrepidwino.com website, as well as lots of different writings that I've done in the past. I'd love to hear from you, so please do get in touch. But until next time, bye.